Stephanie, stand near me, just in case I make a mistake.
Okay.
Stephanie, I do know, is was born and raised in Florida.
Yes.
And is now a long-term resident here in Greater Fall River.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter.
Well, no. I also wanted to mention that she does have her PhD from Penn State in 1997. And she has her library science degree from Drexel University in 2013.
Yep.
She is the editor and publisher of the Pear Tree Press.
Yep.
And she is a designer for the Fall River Historical Society Press. Am I correct so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Stephanie is a leading historian on the Lizzie Borden case. And just in case you're not up on this, on the August the 4th, Dennis Bennett, our assistant curator, and Stephanie will be joining together for the
Lizzie Borden, an Enduring Legacy exhibit tour at the Historical Society.
And that's on August the 4th, which is the anniversary of the killing.
The deaths, yes.
The deaths, okay.
Yes. Murder.
Okay.
The topic of the day.
And finally, I wanted to mention that her lecture tonight is based on John Cummings' 3-volume set of killings and murders.
Stand up, John. Yay!
Over the last 190 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take over.
Thank you. By the way, these books that John envisioned and I assisted on, Murder, Manslaughter, and Mayhem on the South Coast, Volume 1, 2, and 3, are available for sale. There's only two left tonight that we brought with us to sell. The Historical Society did. The rest are at the Historical Society or will be ordered for the Historical Society, so you can always stop by and pick up your copies there. I'll be talking about the murders from those 3 books. Not all of them, of course, because there are way too many. Oh my goodness gracious me. So yeah, it's not as popular. It's just more common than you can understand, and sadly, I would say. So the way we started was John's big idea, and I said, that's brilliant. It's a brilliant idea. Let me help. And so we worked together on these. And these are the 3 volumes. They cover different years. The first one is 1900 to 1969. The second one is 1970 to 1999. And the third one is 2000 to 2016, but it has more cases in it because we added in the ones we missed from the first 2 books that we found later, because there's a lot more to it. So it really covers from 1800 to 2016, but not all of the ones that are in the other books. And nothing is repeated. So you have to buy all 3 books. So John did a lot of the initial research. He spent probably a year or more working on this book, these series of books, and he used various sources. He went to libraries, he went to the Bristol County Courthouse, he went to the Herald News, where they knew him by name, and said, oh, here he is again. The Fall River Historical Society, of course, assisted. Police department spoke to him, and police officers spoke to him, and police chiefs spoke to him, and retired police chiefs spoke to him. I used Ancestry.com and newspapers.com to fill in the blanks and to add some more color from newspaper accountings. Now, it says South Coast, so I don't know if you know this, because I didn't know this, but the South Coast is really technically 16 communities. Acushnet, Berkeley, Dartmouth, Fairhaven, Fall River, Freetown, Marion, Mattapoisett, New Bedford, Rochester, Somerset, Swansea, Wareham, Westport, and 2 in Rhode Island, Little Compton and Tiverton. So that is the South Coast of, I guess, just called the South Coast. It isn't necessarily even called the South Coast of Massachusetts, it's just the South Coast. So our murders cover these areas and pick them from there. Now, a little introduction about the legal proceedings in the various communities. Massachusetts has its own legal order of things, and Rhode Island has their own. So cases that are Rhode Island cases have a difference in one thing. They don't have a preliminary hearing in the process of the accused going through a series of legal procedures. But Massachusetts, now inquest arrest, of course, can go back and forth. You can arrest somebody before an inquest, you can arrest somebody after an inquest, that's fine. So that's a kind of a either or situation. Now the death penalty. This figures into several cases, one tonight especially. The Rhode Island death penalty is interesting because it's the state that has the longest no death penalty of any state in the country. So in 1852, it was one of the earliest states to abolish capital punishment for all crimes. It was reintroduced in 1872, but it was never carried out. And it has the longest period of no executions, none having taken place since 1845. It has performed 52 executions, and a bunch of them, though, were 26 sailors who were hanged for piracy. And they've never executed a female offender, unlike Massachusetts. They used hangings most commonly during those 52 executions. 5 were carried out by an unknown method. It was just not recorded. And gas inhalation was authorized in 73, but was never used. Now, Massachusetts, capital punishment was legal in Massachusetts from 1620 to 1984. The first recorded execution in Massachusetts was John Billington. He was executed by hanging in 1630 for murder. The last execution were gangsters Philip Bellino and Edward Gertson in 1947 for the murder of a Marine. And they were both executed by electric chair. Since then, we have not had another execution. So if you're convicted of murder, there's murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, and manslaughter. And murder in the first degree usually is the penalty is life in prison without parole or life in prison with parole, depending on the circumstances of the case. And what kind of deal you can get with your DA. So why do people kill? For every conceivable reason. And if you see this list I put up, it sounds like the 7 deadly sins, because it is. People kill for any possible reason you can think of. And I had an argument with somebody about the, well, not an argument, a discussion. He said, how come you don't have insanity on there? I said, because insanity is not a reason to kill. It's a condition of a person that has them in a state of mind to kill, but it's certainly not a why. It's a kind of a what or a how, but it's not a why. People don't kill because they're crazy, because there's a lot of crazy people who don't kill, right? All right. One is standing right here. Okay. So we had some research problems. Sometimes you don't get the whole story from the newspaper. Sometimes there's no trial records or they're sealed. Sometimes the crime is not in the newspaper. Sometimes the newspaper gets it wrong, but mostly the newspaper's not online or searchable. Fall River is the worst for this. As you and I both know, probably any of you genealogists, Fall River newspapers are not searchable, they're not digitized, and they're not online. So where do you read them? You go to the Fall River Public Library, or you go to the Fall River Historical Society, which has all the newspapers on microfilm. So you can, as a member, you can go down to do some research, and if you're a non-member, they have a very nominal fee for you to come in and use the library down in the Historical Society. So the problems were interesting as the process went on. For instance, this story. I read this story in the Fitchburg Sentinel, and a lot of times articles about Fall River murders appear in the Fitchburg newspaper, in the Buffalo newspaper, in the New Hampshire newspaper, in the other newspapers, not because I couldn't get my hands online for Fall River. So I read this, Fall River, July 14th, 1899. While in a drunken frenzy, Martin Herren, 25 years old, so severely beat his wife that it is feared she will die from the effects of her wounds. The house was in disorder while on the floor lay the victim of the man's fury, bleeding freely from her wounds, with the bed soaked and the walls spattered with her blood. There were 4 children in the house at the time. Herren had been arrested before and left jail only 2 weeks ago after serving a term for wife beating. At the police station, he admitted that he tried to kill his wife with a flat iron. Now, this is all I read. I could not find out if she lived or died. And that bugged me. I was on the hunt. I had to find out what happened to the wife whose name is not mentioned in the news article, by the way. Thank you, whoever did this article in 1899. She's the victim, but she doesn't deserve to have her name mentioned. So I had to go from his name and try and figure out through Ancestry and other records who this family was. When did he die? Who did he marry? When did they live in Fall River? We're talking city directories, which are online through Ancestry. We're talking Ancestry records and census records and state census records. So with no other leads but this one story and no follow-up reporting located about whether Mrs. Herren, first name not mentioned, survived the ordeal, the hunt was on. Using Ancestry and census birth and death and marriage records, I was able to locate the couple living on Buffington Street in Fall River. His occupation was a machinist and hers was a weaver. I finally discovered her first name, Margaret. Maiden name McMillan, sometimes known as McMullen. Both she and her husband, Martin Herren, were born in Ireland. The couple were married on March 4th, 1892 in Fall River, and they had a child, a boy, on December 28th, 1892, a girl named Mary Bertha in 1896, and a third child, a girl they named Margaret Ethel, born March 15th, 1898. So here we have 4 children in the article. There were only 3. That's fine. That's better than 4, considering there were witnesses to the murder, or the attack, let's put it that way. Okay, Margaret is not listed as deceased until July 1st, 1904. She lived another 5 years. The cause of her death was cerebral abscess. Her spouse at the time of her death is none other than Martin G. Herren. Margaret survived her beating in 1899 and probably many more after, and died at the age of 34 of maladies most likely caused by the gross behavior of her husband. To finish this sad tale, Martin died sometime after 1936, living into his late 50s. So I found out, but it didn't make it any better. It was still terribly, terribly sad. So real people, real stories, emotional tales of love and betrayal and anger and violence. One can get caught up in the reality of what daily life must have been like for some of these suffering people. It takes a while to decompress. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about the statistics in the books that we did, number 1, 2, and 3. The number of victims are listed there. Those who were convicted or pled guilty, those are those numbers from those books. The unsolved or acquitted are listed, paroled or pardoned, murder-suicides, children who are murdered, unknown outcome, and I'll tell you what that means in a sec, adjudged insane, or died before trial. So the unknown outcome, there's 16 of them in book 3 because that book goes to 2016, and a lot of the later cases have not come to trial yet. So I don't know the outcome. Sometimes it was a situation where there was no other notice about whatever happened to this person who was accused, and there's no way for me to figure it out unless I spend the rest of my entire adult life trying to search these people out. I don't know if I can do that. So let's start with Fall River. Fall River murders. I am not going to talk about Lizzie Borden. Oh, come on. And I'm not going to talk about Sarah Cornell. Who? Sarah Cornell, the mill girl who was hanged in South Park. No? and Reverend Avery. Oh, I'm not talking about it. Never mind. Those are the two biggest murder cases that the Fall River's known for. These two big cases where lots of books have been written about them. They're both pretty much unsolved because in both cases, the accused was acquitted. And that's probably why they endure. So I'm not talking about them because I talk about them all the time. The first case I'd like to share with you is Holder and Eliza Borden, 6 months old and 3 years old. This is a murder-suicide. Holder and Eliza were murdered by their mother. Her mother was Eliza Darling Borden. She was 37 years old. According to the Fall River Weekly News, a most melancholy occurrence transpired at 68 2nd Street on May 4th, 1848, between the hours of 4 and 5 p.m. Eliza Borden, the second wife to Lodowick Borden, uncle to Andrew J. Borden, took her 2 youngest children down cellar and drowned them in the cistern. Then, stepping behind the chimney, she cut her own throat with a razor and died. The only offspring that was spared was the couple's oldest child, Maria. This is an image that was used to illustrate the Borden case at the time in the newspapers. I have told you this is the spot where this murder happened, which is next door to 2nd Street. And that's IX, that's the house right there. It's now known as the Kelly House. Now, Mrs. Borden had within a few days shown undeniable evidence of an unsound mind, expressing fears that they would come to want, even though her husband was in good circumstance. A girl who lived with Mrs. Borden went out to get a pail of water, and on her return, Mrs. Borden and the 2 children were missing. She asked the older child where her mother had gone and was told that she had gone into the cellar. She went to the cellar door but was afraid to open it after hearing groans behind the door. The neighbors were called in and found Mrs. Borden extended on the floor with her throat cut and just alive. The children were both dead in the cistern. Now, this is the house from 1893 from the Borden case. This is owned by the Fall River Historical Society, this image. The Borden house is the taller house on the right-hand side, and the Kelly house, or in this case, Lodowick Borden's house, is the one on the right with the shutters. This is 2nd Street. And yes, there was a laundry across the street. In our modern understanding of mental health issues, it's entirely possible that Eliza Darling Borden suffered from postpartum depression. Her last child was born only 6 months before the act that resulted in the death of the 3 people. According to Psychology Today, infanticide is a very rare phenomenon, and only 4% of women who become psychotic kill their babies. It was reported by those that knew her that she committed the lamentable deed in a paroxysm of insanity and had been considered a little out of it in her head the past few days. These murders occurred in the house next door to 92 2nd Street, where 34 years later, Andrew and Abby Borden were hatcheted to death. At the time of the killings of these children, Andrew Borden was 26 years old and resided in his father's home at 12 Ferry Street. It was not until 1872, or 24 years after the murders, that Andrew Borden family would move to 2nd Street. By the way, does anybody need to know what a cistern is? Because I sure didn't know. Do you know what a cistern is?
It collects water.
It does. It collects rainwater, and it's collected in the basement, and it could be made of all kinds of different things, but it usually has a hand pump, and the water is not potable for drinking, but is used for washing and laundry. So it's a collection system for water that comes out of the gutters or the roof down into the cellar that you could use it for other purposes. It's reclamation. It's green cisterns. So that's where that happened, sadly, sadly, sadly. Ellen Murphy. Ellen Murphy was 40 years old when she died. She was killed by her husband, John Murphy, in a very, very horrible way. This happened April 10th, 1853. Ellen Murphy was on one of her drunken rambles. Her husband John went in pursuit of her to bring her home, having a rope in hand. Before setting out, he had procured a half a pint of gin from a woman in the neighborhood and drank it. Having got his wife home about 11 p.m., he threw her upon the bed, and compelling the oldest daughter to hold the mother, he tied his wife's hands and feet together with cords and tied her to the back bedpost with cords proceeding from her hands to her feet. He also passed a rope around her belly, securing her more firmly. Meanwhile, he quieted her by telling her that if she would let him tie her, he would give her some liquor. Having made her fast, he went out to the shed and returned, bringing in some vessel of a quantity of some liquid, telling his wife that she would now get her liquor. Then he attempted to get his oldest daughter to administer the liquor, but she refused. Having stripped the woman of all of her clothes except her chemise, and having pulled that off from around her neck and shoulders and tearing it open in the front, he proceeded to pour the liquid down her throat. It appears that he was aware that this liquid would stain or discolor her clothing, but was ignorant of the fact that it would stain her skin. The liquid given to the woman was sulfuric acid. The poor woman struggled and showed signs of nausea. She was too strongly confined with the cords, however, to free herself or to do anything for her own relief. The 5 children went to bed in another bedroom, and the husband stayed his agonizing, dying wife. She called for water, telling the daughter that she was burning up inside. Some water was given to her by one of the daughters, which is the wrong thing to do, apparently. You're supposed to give baking soda, lime chalk, sal soda, but never water. The daughters lay in bed most of the time, but the eldest 2 kept note of their father's operation. About 12 o'clock, he gave his wife another quantity of liquid. This was he called tea. It's judged to have been a quantity of the acid diluted. The dying woman continued to moan till 3 o'clock in the morning, when the eldest daughter states the noise of her cries ceased. It's probable that death occurred at this time. The husband unbound his wife, stripped the chemise off, and put on a clean one, and then fled. The daughter went to 36 Bedford Street, the grocer, B.F. Winslow, and told him that her mother lay dead in the house, having been murdered by their father. There was a column of froth from her mouth about an inch high, and the sides of her chin, neck, and breast were furrowed with the rills of the liquid, which had marked the course over those parts with crooked black lines. John Murphy, the husband, was found guilty and sentenced to be executed after 1 year's imprisonment. He received his sentence of death without any emotion, and upon being remanded to jail, coldly inquired of the officers whether he would be hanged in Taunton or New Bedford. Nasty, just nasty. Dennis Dunn. If you read Parallel Lives, you read this very sad story. Dennis Dunn was 16 months old. Ellen Dunn was his mother. She was 35. Ellen Dunn's husband, John, was a laborer who couldn't get much work in Fall River, so he had gone to Lake Superior cotton mines in Michigan and was sending money back to the family. The Dunns were the parents of 5 children. They all seem to have 5 kids. Michael, aged 12, a boy about 7, 2 girls aged 5 and 3, and infant Dennis about 16 months. The tenement where Ellen Dunn lived was described in Victorian vistas as disgusting, with great pools of stagnant water deep enough to drown a child in its mud, garbage and filthy smells, enough to sicken a passerby. John had, from time to time, sent his wages back to his family. His wife had received $10 the Friday before the murders, and a portion seems to have been spent on rum. The oldest son, Michael, worked in the mills to help support the family. According to Michael's testimony, remember he's 12 years old, when mother was not in liquor, she was as good as any mother could be. I never knew of her whipping any of the children unless by scolding in a light slap, except me. She whipped me 2 or 3 Sundays ago, but she was in liquor at the time. On July 24th, Mrs. Dunn told Michael that she was ill. She had been on a drunken spree 3 times, much of the time since Friday, and she sent Michael to get her 10 cents worth of whiskey. When the lad returned home, his mother drank half the whiskey. He noted she was not very well in her senses. Young Dennis had been sick, the baby, for a month with whooping cough. That can drive you nuts. All was well when Michael left the house at 3. About 2 hours later, Michael saw Officer Regan and his little sister on the street. He was taking her home. The policeman went up with her and woke Mrs. Dunn, which made her worse than she had been any time that day. Michael said he saw his mother at the window, and she told him to come upstairs, but he decided not to because he was afraid as she looked wild. I was afraid she would whip me, he said. This is where it occurred, 6th and a half Street, between 6th and 7th, in Fall River. Yes, 6th and a half Street, and that's the tenement where it occurred. As reported in Parallel Lives, according to eyewitnesses, Mrs. Dunn had spent a portion of the afternoon drinking again, becoming very noisy and beating the children, which attracted the attention of several neighbors, including Mrs. Olive Fish, who lived in the lower tenement of the same house, and Nellie Driscoll, another 6th and a half Street resident. According to Mrs. Fish, she went out to see what the matter was and heard the neighbors say that Mrs. Dunn was killing her children. Drawn by the goings-on in the 3rd floor tenement, a crowd soon formed on the street, which attracted the attention of Nellie, who, when she went out and asked Mrs. Fish what the matter was, received the repalling reply that Mrs. Dunn was killing her children. Neighbors testified at Mrs. Dunn's trial that they had witnessed her beating the child with a stick, about 1.5 feet long, holding him up by the arm, dropping him on the floor, and striking him on his back. She was seen beating another of her children, returning shortly to abusing the infant. From Parallel Lives, we learn that Nellie went outside and stood looking up at the window of the Dunn tenement, at which time she, to her horror, saw Mrs. Dunn take the child by the legs, holding him out the window. Pleading, Nellie asked her not to kill the child, at which Mrs. Dunn struck it against the house 2 or 3 times and threw it out to the street, remarking, "There's one, I'll give you another." The child fell on the banister and landed over 12 feet away from the house. Frantically, Nellie Driscoll ran to catch the child, but it struck before she could get to it. Daniel Dunn was severely injured and lived for another 45 minutes before he died, having suffered a great deal. The trial of Ellen Dunn was held in September 1876 at the Superior Court in Taunton. While proven guilty for the act of killing Dennis, the jury determined that they were not satisfied Mrs. Dunn was of sound mind when the act of killing was done, so as to be legally accountable. After the hearing on her mental condition, Ellen Dunn was discharged and released. Bertha! I'm interested in Bertha. I like Bertha. When I came to Fall River, before I moved here, I went to Oak Grove Cemetery, and Tommy Egan was the cemetery guy, but he was the head of parks, right? And we came, my sister and I, and we said, we'd like to go, where's Bertha Manchester buried? And his face lit up. He's like, nobody asked for Bertha. Everybody asked for Lizzie, but nobody, let me take you there myself. He was so pleased that Bertha was being remembered. Bertha was another axe murder in Fall River, by the way, and it happened 5 days before the Borden trial in New Bedford. So there was talk that they were somehow connected, and possibly that we had a multiple axe murderer in our midst. But Bertha was killed by Jose Correa de Mello, who was 18 years old. Bertha was 22. She was the daughter of Stephen Manchester and was hacked to death with an axe in the early afternoon of Memorial Day 1893 in the Manchester Milk Farm in Upper New Boston Road, now Meridian Street. The farm is no longer there, the farmhouse is no longer there, I've checked it out, but the location still exists, of course. Berthas Murder occurred just 5 days before the trial, Lizzie Borden trial, and it became nationally famous because of that. Bertha was last seen alive about 7:30 in the morning when her father, Stephen Manchester, left for the city, accompanied by his son and hired boy to deliver milk on his regular route. About 2 o'clock they arrived home, and Freddie, her little brother, 12 years old, ran ahead to the house to get something to eat. He opened the kitchen door and saw his murdered sister laying in a pool of blood on the floor. He ran back to the barn and told his father, who immediately notified the police. A bloody axe was found in a woodpile near the back fence. Bertha was lying close to the foot of the stove. Her right leg was drawn under her body, her clothes were partially drawn from her hips, and her head and face were frightfully mutilated. There were 4 long, deep cuts in the back of her head, and the top of her skull was crushed to jelly. There were several cuts to the face and nose, and 2 of the girl's teeth were found beside her on the floor. Her loose hair was matted with blood, and her arms and face were covered with it. On searching the house, the police found that the girl's bedroom had been rifled and some of its contents taken. The police believe the motive was robbery. People who knew the murdered girl said she was a household drudge for the past 4 years. Her father married his second wife about 8 years before, but they were not living happily, although a boy, Frederick, had been born to them. For many months, For many months, the woman had been drawing a current sum for her maintenance, this is the wife, and living elsewhere, while her husband had been endeavoring to obtain a divorce. It is known that for many months, Bertha had been her father's greatest help in caring for his 19 cows, 3 horses, and large farmhouse. She had frequently complained about her hard lot in life. She possessed a good figure, and her face was attractive and lovable. Not anymore. It was determined that Bertha had died about 9:30 in the morning. 4 days later, on June 4th, Jose Correa de Mello, a recent Portuguese immigrant from the Azores, was arrested for the murder and arraigned the following morning. On the day of the murder, he had entered a French-Canadian shoe dealer store near the south end of Sagamore Mill and asked in broken English for a pair of shoes. He pulled out of his pocket a silver trade dollar, bright and apparently new. He also pulled out of his pocket a silver $half with a hole in it. It was learned that Mr. Manchester had given silver trade dollars to Bertha, which she kept in her bureau drawer, with a $half, and she had a $half with a hole in it. Correa denied that he had ever offered a silver $half with a hole in it to the dealer, or that he had any conversation with the shoe dealer in relation to the trade dollar. But a Portuguese who acted as an interpreter with the French Canadian said, no, that's not what happened at all, and stated positively that he had offered the $half with the hole in it. The shoe dealer said that Correa had what appeared to be a lady's pocketbook with a clasp on it. Such was taken from Bertha's bedroom, but he denied having this in his possession. Marshal Hilliard said that Correa had told a number of conflicting stories since he had brought in, and he had somehow acquired a reputation after being in the United States for a very short time of being shiftless, worthless sort of fellow. Now, we don't know if he really was or if that's just how they labeled him because he was accused of murder. Who knows? On the night of June 6th, they took him to a point near Highland Road, less than a mile northwest of the Manchester house, and they led him into a farm wall, and he pulled out Bertha's watch and gave it up. He went to the Manchester house to rob it, entered it, and he knew the habits of the old man, and he didn't think Bertha would be home. After taking the watch and money, he came downstairs from the upstairs bedroom, only to find Bertha standing there with an axe in her hand. She had undoubtedly heard him, and she grabbed the weapon, and which afterward caused her death, because it was the handiest thing to protect herself with. She met Correa at the entrance to the dining room. He struck the axe as if to ward off a blow, and the blade made a peculiar cut across, a cut afterward found in the girl's forehead. He struck her in the mouth as she grappled with him, and this blow perhaps knocked out her teeth. Correa was recognized, and he felt that in order to get away, he must kill, and he did. The accused, who spoke no English, pled not guilty at his arraignment, but changed his pleas to guilty on September 18th. He was convicted of second-degree murder on January 8, 1894. He was sentenced to state prison for life. 20 years later, on December 31st, 1913, Jose Correa de Mello was pardoned from any further imprisonment under the condition that if he committed any crime, he would be returned to jail for the remainder of his term and then deported back to the Azores, told never to come back to this country. So the Azores got a killer. Yeah. That's not fair. Okay. Well, he went back. Nobody ever heard from him again. Hope none of you are related to the poor bugger. Baby James Connolly. These are in chronological order. This occurred, the baby was 2 years old. This is a murder-suicide, and was brought to my attention by a member of the audience here. Ken Raposo, where are you, Ken? Raise your hand.
Okay, I'm related to the victim, not the perpetrator.
He said, did you know about this murder? I'm like, absolutely not. Because Fall River newspapers, if it's in the Fall River newspaper, it's hard to search for it, right? So baby James Connolly was 2 years old and his father was 38. Mother Mary Connolly returned home to her tenement apartment at 60 Orange Street in Fall River around 8:50 p.m. and was sickened to discover that her husband of 6 years had murdered her 2-year-old son, James, with a razor to the neck, and then used the same tool and ended his own life by slitting his own throat. John had been not regularly employed, but was most recently a spinner in the merchant's mill, and his wife was a weaver in the same mill. Mary had reported that her husband had said the previous Sunday that he wanted to commit suicide, but she talked him out of it and made him promise not to drink any longer, and he agreed. Their second son was living with the grandmother, Mary's mother, on Healy Street. Mary had thought all was well when she left the house to visit her son that evening. John seemed normal, and he was talking about looking for work the next morning. He was sober. A friend named Neary visited him early in the evening, and when he left at a few minutes after 8, John locked the door, and shortly after that, committed the horrific act. Mrs. Connolly said that her husband always had been a kind man to herself and her children. The newspapers reported that the cause of this act was a morose, sullen, despondent condition of mind, one bordering on delirium tremens. But we don't know what went on between them. We don't know why one child is living somewhere else and one child is living there. We don't know if he hated this child for some reason. Was it his child? Did he harbor problems with the child? But to kill a child and then kill yourself seems a bit horrific to me, because the kid is totally innocent no matter what his condition or his birthright is. Wilfred Bedard. Here we have a husband murdered by a wife. About time. Wilfred Bedard was 30 years old and his wife was 23. After a day-long argument, Alma Bedard plunged a butcher knife into the side of her husband above the heart, moved him to the bed, and left him to die. The quarrel was over Wilfred's demand for 25 cents, which she said he wanted to use to buy liquor. The house was at 112 Lowell Street. Alma admitted to the stabbing after 6 hours of interrogation, after first asserting that she had found him in that condition on the floor and had moved him to the bed. Wilfred and Alma had been married in 1936 and had no children. This is Alma. On July 2nd, 1938, Alma Bedard was convicted of manslaughter in the stabbing death of her husband. She was sentenced to 12 years in the Massachusetts Reformatory for Women in New Bedford. Census records from 1940 show that she was still in jail 2 years later, working as a mill operator. Genealogical records indicate that by 1948, Alma had been released and was working at the New Bedford YMCA. Where she was living at 310 Pleasant Street in New Bedford. She was forever known as the 25-cent killer. No kidding. That's what the papers dubbed her. You know how the newspapers like to have a kind of a killer, like the highway murders. This is the 25-cent killer. Kind of cheap if you ask me. Eight-year-old Teresa LaFleur. Charles McGarity was 25 and her uncle. Brother to her mother, Veronica. When Veronica's husband, Leo LaFleur, asked where his daughter was, McGarity, the dishonorably discharged Navy veteran, responded, "I killed her, so what?" He had a conflict with Leo, apparently. The LaFleurs lived at 62 Quarry Street in Fall River. The 8-year-old Teresa, the second oldest of 5 in her family, was beaten and choked to death, and her body left in a section of the Watuppa freight shed on Rodman Street. Her body was found after a 4-hour search. Police were shocked by the condition in which they found the child's body after being guided by the uncle to the wooded section where he had concealed it in the brush. Later reports called this a rape slaying. McGarity was a reformatory parolee who had been released a year previously after serving 11 months of 2 concurrent 5-year sentences for larceny and robbery of an automobile. Usually serving at least 30 months of such a sentence is necessary for release, but the board said his record was good and members of the family had asked for his release so that he might care for his ill mother. Charles McGarity pleaded not guilty at the trial and denied under direct examination that he had confessed, even though he took them to the body, so, you know. At the trial, he said, "I was sleepy and wanted to get the interrogation over with. I would have admitted anything to get out of police headquarters." He recalled meeting Teresa and taking her for a walk to the Fall River freight yard. "What happened on the hill?" asked the district attorney. "I don't remember," McGarity replied. "I think I grabbed her by the throat. I don't know, I'm trying to remember." He said that he had been drinking for 3 or 4 days before his niece was slain. A picture of the girl's body was on the stenographer's table directly in front of the witness stand as McGarity began to testify. He averted his eyes for several minutes and then leaned over and turned it face down. He was convicted on February 27, 1948 of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in the electric chair. In 1949, a federal court order was issued that blocked the execution for 2 weeks. After 11 reprieves and a call for a new trial, during the 3.5 years since he was convicted, McGarity's sentence was commuted in 1951 by Governor's Executive Council. He's still in jail, but he doesn't have the death penalty anymore. Veronica LaFleur, Teresa's mother, later went on record to oppose the death penalty in Massachusetts during the height of the capital punishment debate in the 1940s. She wrote a letter which was read in the Massachusetts Senate in 1949 during the debate on bills to modify the Massachusetts law, which made execution the mandatory sentence in cases where the conviction was of first-degree murder. The bills were defeated. Her letter read in part, "Although it was my child, I do not wish to see my brother go to the chair. If he does, I, that child's mother, will not feel justice has triumphed." Charles McGarity died in Attleboro on October 20th, 1994, at the age of 72. Obviously, he had been paroled at some point. Some of you might remember this case from 1960. Maybe. Emily Odie, she was 72. She was killed by a young man who was 16 years old, Robert Cusick. A newspaper left on the outside of the cottage of elderly single lady who lived alone at 713 Duval Street in Fall River was assigned to the newspaper carrier that something was amiss. The paperboy knocked on the door, but there was no response. He had been Miss Odie's newspaper boy for 2 years, and he knew that she read that paper every day and was extremely interested in what went on in her city, and she hadn't picked up the day before's Herald News, so he knew something was wrong. He went across the street to the oil company, and they both decided to call the police. Emily Odie was retired from the Income Tax Division of the Massachusetts Department of Corporations and Taxation. Patrolman Alfred Picard arrived and found the door locked, front door. He went around the outside, trying the windows and peering in, hoping that he would find an innocent explanation for her whereabouts. He had to force open a side window to gain access. He found nothing in the downstairs living room and bedroom, but when he turned on the lights in the kitchen, he saw the sinister path of streaked reddish brown leading to the door of the woodshed. When he looked down the steps into the shed, he saw a form covered in burlap bags and a bloody sheet. As he pulled back the coverings, he realized he had found the grisly remains of Miss Emily Odie. Fingerprints left in the house at the murder scene and in the upstairs bedroom where the murderer gained access led police to a neighborhood youth, Bob Cusick, who lived near Odie's home. The lead detective found a pair of bloody scissors on the scene and blood on a picket fence and tines on a pitchfork in the shed. They had been plunged into the elder lady's neck and heart in her kitchen before she was dragged to the shed that adjoined the kitchen. After fingerprints revealed the potential murderer was the young boy who attended the Ruggles School for Special Education students, he was questioned for a second time by the police and admitted that he killed the woman that had befriended him. Mrs. Odie had several puncture wounds on her chest and was badly beaten about the head. She was fully clothed and there was no sign of a struggle. Robbery did not seem to be the motive. The autopsy found that death had been caused by multiple lacerations about the face and upper body, but any one of them could have killed her. She had also been cruelly bludgeoned as revealed by the many fractures and injuries on the upper part of her body. The stab wounds penetrated her heart and lungs, and there was a skull fracture. The knife, picket fence, and pitchfork were undoubtedly the death weapons. The victim had been slain sometime between 11 and 1 on Wednesday, April 19th. She had not been sexually attacked. Police said the boy told them that the stabbing occurred when he broke into Mrs. Odie's house seeking stamps for his collection. The woman discovered him and took up a fence picket to just drive him away. When the boy wrenched the picket out of her hand, she seized the scissors. Police said the boy told them that he took the scissors away from her and stabbed her with him. She had apparently been struck down from the rear and stabbed several times. A pair of scissors believed to be the weapon was found in an empty coal stove in the kitchen. Cusick had a prior juvenile record for attacking a young girl. Robert Cusick was charged with murder. He was confused and innocent, and an innocent plea was entered for him. Robert, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Edward Cusick, was first arraigned as a juvenile and then brought into open court as an adult. He was charged with first-degree murder, but was ruled to be insane. Robert Cusick was sentenced to the Bridgewater State Hospital. In 1965, at the age of 21, he was ruled to be fit to stand trial for the 1960 murder, but no other information was ever available for me to find what happened. So I don't know if he was convicted. He doesn't exist in census records. I have no idea if he died. I have no idea. So it's, at least they caught the person, but I don't know if he faced justice. The Fall River cult murders. Doreen Levesque, 17, Barbara Ann Raposa, 22, and Karen Marsden, 20. These are the dates of their death. Accused of the murder of Doreen Levesque was Robin Murphy. Accused of the murder of Barbara Ann Raposa was Andre Maltus, witnessed by Robin Murphy. Accused of the murder of Karen Marsden was Robin Murphy and Carl Drew. There's a pattern here. There's one name involved in all three. Doreen Levesque. Her bludgeoned body was found by two female joggers on October 13, 1979, beneath the bleachers at Diamond Vocational School. Her skull was crushed and her hands were tied. She was 17 years old. Face down in the grass, with her hands bound, her body was a mess of cuts and bruises with signs of sexual assault, and her face and skull were so broken and crushed that she was unrecognizable. She was a runaway and a known prostitute. She had been drawn to Fall River from New Bedford as the rumors of money to be made in prostitution in Fall River had spread beyond the little town's borders. Robin Murphy pled guilty and was convicted of the murder of Doreen Levesque. Murphy later recanted her testimony, so the case remains unsolved. When Murphy made the plea deal with District Attorney Ronald Pena for her testimony against Carl Drew for the third murder, Pena declined to charge her again for the murder of Doreen Levesque. Technically, it's still an open case. Barbara Ann Raposa. On Wednesday, November 7th, 1979, David Cowan picked up Raposa and her infant son, Eric, at her apartment in Fall River. They left Eric at a babysitter's apartment so they could go to a movie. They stopped at a restaurant. Raposa, in need of money, decided instead to spend the evening working the street as a prostitute. She had Cowan drop her off on the street in Fall River and arranged for him to meet her later at a nearby saloon. He waited until 1 a.m. the next morning, venturing out to look for her at intervals, but she did not appear. Her father reported her disappearance the next evening. On January 26, 1980, Raposa's body, with hands bound and crushed, skull crushed, was discovered in the woods near R.E. Smith's company plant in Fall River on Jefferson Street. Robin Murphy, the chief prosecution witness, said that she and Andre Maltes, like Maltese, but Maltese, okay. That she had met Andre Maltese in a bar in Fall River at midnight on the date of Raposa's disappearance. Murphy and Maltese went to a local diner to pick up Raposa. As they drove there, Maltese told Murphy that he intended to kill Raposa for dating David Cowan. When the three of them left the diner, Raposa was in the front seat of the car with Maltese, and Murphy was in the back seat. Maltese gave his passengers some marijuana, and all three of them smoked it. Murphy and Raposa started fighting. The fight continued until Maltese stopped the car in the woods near Resco and pulled Raposa away from Murphy. Maltese and Raposa talked outside of the car while Murphy remained inside. Now, this is her saying this, okay? Murphy said that Maltese returned to the car, got the keys, and opened the trunk. He removed 2 paper bags and went into the woods with Raposa. Murphy observed the defendant and Raposa having sexual relations. Murphy remained in the car, listening to the radio and turning it up. She heard Raposa scream, so she turned it up some more. She turned toward the wooded area and saw Maltese sitting on Raposa, holding a rock high above her head with both hands. She said she turned away and continued listening to the radio. Now, if you believe this, you are as gullible as they come. Maltese returned to the car, she said, and placed the 2 paper bags in the trunk. He told Murphy that he wanted the victim to crawl away. He drove Murphy to her mother's home, and Murphy testified that Maltese threatened that someone would get her, Robin, if she said anything against him. On February 7th, 1980, nearly 2 weeks after Raposa's body was discovered, Maltese was arrested and charged with her murder. At trial, he testified that he'd been home with his mother that night, and his mother said, yes, he was with me. On January 30th, 1981, a jury found Maltese guilty of murder in the 1st degree. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died 6 years after his conviction after a series of 6 strokes left him mentally ill. He was appealing his case at the time of his death. Karen Marsden. On April 13, 1980, a portion of a human skull was found in the woods near an area known as Family Beach in Westport. A subsequent search of the area yielded various items of clothing, blood-stained rocks, jewelry, and a clump of hair. The remains were identified as Karen Marsden, a young woman from Fall River. From February to November 1979, Marsden had worked for Carl Drew as a prostitute on Bedford Street area of Fall River. In the summer of '79, Marsden met Robin Murphy, who was also acquainted with Carl Drew. There was evidence that Marsden and Murphy, along with other prostitutes and pimps from the Fall River area, attended satanic ritual meetings conducted by Carl Drew. Think of Carl Drew as kind of a Charlie Manson. He doesn't really get his hands dirty until he feels like it, and he's got this sort of mind control over these girls. And but he really wasn't that charismatic. So it's sort of more like Robin was the charismatic one. I talked to someone who knew her in high school, and she was one of the most popular people at Durfee. She always had friends around her. She was very outgoing. She was a little on the wild side, but very carefree, kind of a free spirit. And she was hilarious. She had a great sense of humor, but people were drawn to her because of her personality. Now, Marsden attempted to sever her relationship with Carl Drew and with the satanic group. And Marsden and Drew threatened to kill her on several occasions. In December '79, Marsden went into hiding. She began living with Murphy and another woman named Carol Fletcher. At this time, Marsden met 5 or 6 times with an officer of the Massachusetts State Police who was investigating the death of Levesque. Now, Alan Sylvia, who is the state rep, worked this case. And he knew her very well. He said that the prostitutes in Fall River were informants for the police, so they treated them with respect because they gave them lots of information about drugs, they gave them lots of information about other crimes that were going on, and so they sort of knew all their names and they knew all the police, and they all got along just fine because there was this communication system set up for reporting of other issues that needed to be taken care of in the city. And he's particularly upset about this situation because he was sort of her handler. And he talks about taking her, she wanted to break away from the satanic part, and she actually asked him to take her to St. Mary's. And he did, and he dropped her off there, and he said, you want me to come in? And she said no, and that was the last time he saw her. On the evening of February 8, 1980, Marsden, Fletcher, and Murphy were riding in Fletcher's car along Bedford Street. At some point, Drew got into the car along with Carl Davis. Davis directed Fletcher to drive to Family Beach. When the group arrived there, Drew ordered Murphy to take Marsden out of the car. Murphy dragged Marsden by the throat and hair into the woods. As she did this, Drew walked alongside while Fletcher and Davis followed close behind. Murphy and Drew began striking Marsden with rocks. Drew ordered Murphy to slit Marsden's throat, and Murphy complied. Drew then tore the head from the body and kicked it. Some months later, Drew admitted to Leah Johnson, who was then working for and living with Drew, that he had killed a girl in the presence of Murphy, Davis, and another woman. He recounted in detail how she'd been killed and told Johnson that he had killed the girl because she wanted to leave the cult, and he wanted her to feel pain. Drew testified that he had spent the evening of the murder in 2 bars on Bedford Street. Margarita Rev-Orido testified that she worked for the defendant that evening as a prostitute, and that she was never out of Drew's presence for longer than 15 minutes. On cross-examination, however, she admitted that she was with him every Friday night, so she's no way of knowing if that Friday was the Friday that they all ran together for her. There was evidence that Drew murdered Marsden because she was an eyewitness to the Levesque murder and in retaliation for her speaking to the police. There was also evidence shortly after the Levesque murder that Marsden attempted to sever her ties with Drew, that he threatened to kill her, that she hid from Drew, and that Drew knew she was hiding from him and knew she was talking to the police. Carl Drew was convicted of first-degree murder in 1981 and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Robin Murphy, nope, let's go back. There we go. Robin Murphy pleaded guilty to murder on the second degree in exchange for her testimony against Carl Drew and was granted immunity from prosecution for any involvement in the death of Doreen Levesque. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. She was incarcerated in January 1981 when she was 18 years old. From 81 to 2004, this, by the way, is Pier 14. This was his home base. This is now a parking lot, but this was where he ran his women out of. Murphy was granted parole, believe it or not, 7 years later on May 3rd, 2004. On July 19, 2011, 7 years later, she was stopped by Chelsea police working a stakeout for an unrelated investigation, and they found Murphy in the presence of a convicted felon with heroin in her purse, a violation of parole. She also failed to notify the parole officer that she had had contact with the police. The parole board met and unanimously revoked her parole in October of 2012. Let me see if I got her face. Yeah, here we go. Murphy applied for parole again in March of 2017. The parole board questioned her ability to tell the truth and stated that they didn't trust anything she said. Her parole was denied on November 1st, 2017. This is her in 1981. This is her today.
Where is she incarcerated currently?
I don't know. That's a good question. State prison? No,
Dartmouth's the closest women's prison, but that's short term.
no, she's in state prison, yeah. Carl Drew applied to the Innocence Project to help him overturn his conviction, citing a massive case overload. They said no.
Testimony sent two men to jail for life, but the woman who struck a plea deal in connection with 3 local satanic cult killings decades ago has now recanted her original story, and prosecutors may not be able to do anything about it. Team 5 investigates Michelle McPhee has the exclusive update.
It was an explosive about face.
I lied about that, yes. The entire thing. Correct.
Only News Center 5 has obtained this parole board testimony from March. It shows Robin Murphy recanting her 1981 testimony about the killings of 3 women in Fall River. Testimony that sent 2 men to prison for life.
You're without doubt stating on the record, I'm a liar, and I lied under oath, and I lied about some really important things that got people convicted of first-degree murder.
But angry prosecutors tell Team 5 Murphy's immunity deal is leaving them powerless to reopen or even re-examine the case.
And she's had literally, Michelle, 5, 6, 7 different versions. Am I frustrated? I think I'm more than frustrated. I'm very concerned. I'm very dismayed about that. The immunity agreement is almost ironclad. There's no potential whatsoever to re-prosecute her for first-degree murder. That's closed.
Sutter said he plans to meet with the lead investigator in the cult killings, now retired Fall River detective Paul Carey. All these years later, he's angry too, that Murphy was granted immunity without revealing critical information. One of the victims' bodies was never found.
She must look at the totality, even though she wasn't charged with the other murders. They were all connected by her own admission to being there at the time.
One of the men convicted after Murphy's testimony died in prison. The other, Carl Drew, is now appealing to the Innocence Project for help.
We're interested in rightful convictions, not wrongful convictions.
Thanks to a plea deal, Robin Murphy served 22 years and was freed in 2004. Now she's back behind bars while the DA and the parole board look into what, if anything, they can do. Murphy's lawyer had no comment. If Team 5 investigates, I'm Michelle McPhee.
So you can hear her voice.
When was that?
That was during her parole hearing when she was picked up after her parole. So this was 2012. I wouldn't want to meet her in the dark alley. That's all I got to say. She scares me. See, if you study the case and stuff, you wonder, is it really him that's in charge or was it her in charge? And if it was her in charge, then it makes sense that she gets off with the lightest sentence because she's that manipulative, right? And so you just wonder. You don't know for real because everybody lies. And when everybody lies, you can't get to the truth. And there's not enough evidence to say one thing or another. She was just there for all three. That's got to tell you something. And I think the district attorney before Sutter was Pina. He had it in his head he was going to get Carl Drew. He inserted himself into the case, and he insisted that he was the mastermind. But I think he wanted his Charlie Manson. He wanted his helter-skelter guy. And so he thought that that had to be the answer, that the man had to be the most manipulative instead of accepting the possibility that this woman could have done it herself. So he insisted on everybody testifying against Carl Drew. And while Carl Drew was indeed guilty of the third murder and ordering people around, he wasn't present at all for the first or the second. Well, she was. And she had sexual relationships with some of the other women in the case that ended up dead. So she was an entirely vindictive and jealous person as well. She hasn't changed her gender. She hasn't had a sex change operation. She has just become more masculine as time has gone on. Gail Botello, 32 years old. Gail Botello was murdered by Daniel Tavares, who was 22 at the time. He was 10 years younger. Gail Botello, an unmarried mother of 3 children, left her home at 114 Prospect Street in Fall River on October 27th and was never seen alive again. Her skeletal remains were found 12 years later. Guess where? Across the street. At 314 June Street, the former home of Daniel Tavares. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds. Police had received a tip from Daniel Tavares. This is a guy who likes to let people know what he does. He claims responsibility for things, but there's proof that he's done them. He was serving time for murdering his mother. He led investigators to her remains, the backyard of his former home. His defense was he was not the killer, but was with 2 people who did it at a wild party. At the time, there was not enough evidence to charge him with the crime. Tavares was released from prison in 2007 and moved to Washington State, where he fairly soon killed his neighbors, Brian and Beverly Mock. A witness to Botello's murder came forward with a change of heart and accused Botello of the crime. Botello's case remained unsolved from 2013 until 2013, when a grand jury indicted Tavares, then 47, he was 22 when he committed the crime of murder. He was already serving a life sentence in Washington State for the Washington murder that he had committed in 2007. And he had previously served 16 years in Walpole State for stabbing his mother, Ann Tavares, to death in 1991 in Fall River. He pleaded not guilty to Botello's murder. The prosecution argued that the murder took place in his bedroom because she and her boyfriend owed him money for cocaine. He tried to shoot her, but his gun jammed, so he stabbed her several times in the back of the neck and buried her beneath a brick outdoor barbecue that had been built against a wall that separated the yard from the driveway of the house next door. In 2015, 27 years after her murder, Daniel Tavares was convicted of first-degree murder without the possibility of parole. He will return tonight. Not in this room. He's involved possibly in another case. This is the last Fall River case that I want to share with you. Thomas Gunther. He was 49. He was killed by a man named Raymond Cook, who was 46. On the afternoon of August 24th, 1994, Officer Thomas Gunther of the Fall River Police Department was in uniform, delivering parking permits to residents on Middle Street for use during the upcoming feast. Jean Felix and her daughter residents of the second-floor apartment at 591 Middle Street, were outside that building and saw Officer Gunta enter it. Raymond Cook lived on the first floor. Felix and his daughter heard Cook say, "Who is it?" And then heard Officer Gunta reply, "The police." The women then heard yelling and scuffing and shouts and shots. Felix ran down the door to dial 911. Cook, full of blood and holding a revolver and a walkie-talkie, walked down the stairs leading from the apartment. Felix asked him what he had done, and Cook replied, "Well, he tried to shoot me, so I shot him back." Felix found Officer Gunta lying in the hallway floor outside Cook's apartment, bleeding profusely and gurgling. Felix asked Cook to get some towels as she began chest compressions. Cook placed a pillow under Gunta's head, then kicked him and said, "He's only faking anyway." As Detective Leo Rebello approached the stairway, guns drawn, he saw Cook step onto the landing holding what turned out to be Officer Gunta's handgun and observed on the stairs a police radio with blood on it. Detective Rebello followed Cook into the building and observed Officer Gunta on the hallway floor. Detective Rebello pushed Cook against the hallway wall, and Cook dropped the handgun. In his right hand, he held a speed loader, a device that holds ammunition, and a Fall River police badge. When Detective Rebello had to pry it out of his hands, he handcuffed Cook, moved him back into his apartment, and seated him on a mattress, with Cook saying, "I shouldn't have, I shouldn't have." Detective John DeMello saw Cook drop the gun. Officer Gunta soon thereafter was pronounced dead after suffering 3 gunshot wounds, a close contact wound to the upper back at the base of the neck, penetrating his heart and lung, a wound to his lower back, and a wound below the right knee. Officer Gunta also had abrasions and contusions consistent with having had an altercation. At the police station, Cook stated that he awoke from a nap with an altercation outside of his door, and he heard bangs, and he opened the door, and he saw him on his side bleeding in the hallway, and he asked him if he was all right, and the officer asked him to get help. Cook saw the officer's police radio and tried to use it to call, but Cook denied ever handling his service revolver or badge. He stated that he was taking prescription medication. Toward the end of the interview, he started to address Trooper Blaney as "Your Excellency." Blood spatter analysis indicated that Gunta had been inside Cook's apartment when he was shot. Firearms evidence revealed that his gun had been fired 6 times. There was evidence concerning Cook's behavior before, and on the day of Officer Gunta's killing, Cook was described as a man who hated cops, who stated to Felix that the police would be sorry if they threw him off the basketball court again after curfew. On the day of Officer Gunta's killing, Felix knew Cook was a little bothered, and the police were giving him parking tickets. Even though they weren't giving parking tickets, he was giving parking permits. At his trial, Raymond Cook did not testify. He was an educated man who obtained both criminal justice and law degrees and had served in the military. But in early 1993, he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His son, who lived with him in August of '94, said that Cook thought he was God and a Navy admiral. He did not always recognize his own son. His son kept his own daughter away from his father because he thought she would not be safe. He thought inanimate objects were animate. He put food in his hair, saying it needed food. He threw away his medicine and sometimes left the apartment barefoot and in dirty clothes, and he rarely bathed. He would shoot baskets in the park in his shorts in the dead of winter. He was evaluated by various psychologists and psychiatrists, and they all said he was mentally ill. 2 of the professionals arrived at the opinion that Cook was not criminally responsible because his schizophrenia resulted in the lack of capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. And because of schizophrenia, he lacked the capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct. He was convicted of murder in the 1st degree on the theory of extreme atrocity and cruelty. He sits in prison. It's a very sad story. How many of you are from Little Compton or live in Little Compton? I have 2 very terrible stories to share with you. Sorry to say, I hope you lock your doors at night. Because both of these people had stuff happen in their own house. Peleg Cornell, February 11th, 1902. According to the Newport Mercury, a dastardly murder was discovered yesterday in a lonely spot, 2.5 miles from the village of Little Compton, and on the Adamsville Road. The victim, Peleg Cornell, 70, lived alone, and when found, he was lying on the floor of his own house in a pool of blood with his head battered in and almost severed from his body. The house where he resided was a one-story building with 2 rooms. It was across from a roadway leading from Little Compton to Adamsville, about midway between the 2 places. All about the house were woods, while on the opposite side was a thick wood and a cart path leading back from the road nearly opposite. The nearest neighbor was 500 feet away. So he was cut off from his neighbors by trees, and a lot of trees, and foliage. The only building within 1 mile on the south side was a schoolhouse, which stood on the crest of what is known as Simmons Hill, a few hundred yards away. He was cut off from all neighbors as far as actual view of his premises is concerned. On February 11th, about 6 o'clock, Cornell was last seen alive, and his neighbor, Duvall, who had passed his place at 10:30 the same night, noticed that the house was dark, and supposing that the old man had retired, continued on his way home. When there was no sign of him about the house, a coroner was notified, and a medical officer and town sergeant went to the house. When they broke into the house, which the door was locked, they saw him lying on the floor in the inner room. A huge gash in the man's throat penetrated to the spinal column, almost severing the head from the body. Further examination showed that his head had been literally showered with blows dealt with a blunt instrument. A cut on top of the head, running back from the forehead, might have been made with a dull axe, while a blow that had crushed the frontal bone was evidently dealt with a blunt instrument. Another gash was found under the right eye. About the house, everything appeared in order. Cornell had made his usual preparations for retiring. There was no signs of a scuffle. In the oven of the stove was a little armful of wood placed there to dry for the morning fire. The oil in the lamp showed evidence of being burned, but for a short time. There was a brick found in his bed, wrapped in cloth, placed there so that he could heat his bedclothes at night. 2 chairs were pulled up to the kitchen stove, as though 2 people had been seated, and on a shelf nearby was a glass half full of cider. The autopsy showed that death had probably been caused by a wound to the neck, but they didn't know which happened first. 31. And the man was unconscious. The murderer, in the opinion of the doctors, knocked him down and then proceeded to overkill him. It was decided that the man had been dead about 36 hours or so. As to the murderer, after finishing the work, he apparently left the house, locking the door. In the cart path near the house, about 500 feet into the woods, school children found the axe, which was identified as the murder weapon. He had resided in Little Compton for 3 years, having come from Tiverton. He did not work and had no visible means of support. His house was known as a resort for rough characters, to whom he sold cider, stronger liquor for it was really difficult for him to obtain. So he made his own. He was known to have a small amount of money. Just before his death, this money and an old leather wallet was missing, so they figured robbery was the motive. In his younger days, Cornell had been convicted of arson in Portsmouth and had served a long term in state prison. He is said to have been apprehensive of bodily harm and had a huge club in his house which to protect himself. He had consulted a lawyer with regards to selling of the cider, and learning that by refusing to sell by the glass, he kept within the law and conducted a business in that manner. The murder remained unsolved until 8 years later. A man by the name of Angles, A-N-G-L-E-S, Angles Snell. Yeah, what a name, right? Angles Snell died in Massachusetts State Prison. He confessed to 5 murders before his death, one of them Peleg Cornell. Snell will make another appearance in another case of Tillinghast Kirby. Snell appears to be a man who murdered for money and almost always complete strangers, making him a likely suspect in many unsolved crimes in the area that extend from Wareham to Little Compton. Perhaps he's our first South Coast serial killer. Angela Spence Shaw was 66 years old. She was killed by a man named Jerry Motika, who was 23. At some point during the late evening of Saturday, May 29th, 1999, Angela Spence Shaw was brutally murdered in her home. When she failed to show up at work on Sunday morning, her friend went to visit her home to check on her, and she found her severely beaten and lifeless in the bathtub. There was also an electric hairdryer in the bathtub, which her friend unplugged. It was later determined that in addition to having been savagely beaten, she had also been raped. The medical examiner attributed her death to drowning in the bathwater, as well as substantial blunt force trauma that she had suffered. Her home did not appear to have been ransacked. In fact, both her wallet and cash, which she kept in a ceramic box on her bedroom dresser, amounting to more than $500, remained untouched. Her jewelry was also undisturbed. Moreover, there was no sign of forced entry. By contrast, in her bedroom, which adjoined the bathroom where the body was discovered, there were numerous indicia of the violent attack that had occurred. Puddles of blood, the bed had been stripped, there was a blood-stained pillow and pillowcase. When she was found, she had only a pink nightshirt and was wearing nothing below the waist. According to first responders, she was severely beaten and unrecognizable. Apparently she was still alive when placed underwater in the bathtub following the brutal beating and rape. They know this because there was water in the lungs, which means she inhaled it as alive, because it doesn't seep into your mouth after you're dead. The seminal fluid and sperm cells were present in both her vagina and her rectum. At the time of her murder, she was in the process of renovating her home. On Friday, May 28, 1999, a construction crew had broken through a wall of her house as part of a process of connecting an addition, which left her house temporarily unsecured. Anyone who knew about that temporary opening in the wall could have easily entered. Jeremy Motika, a carpenter, was part of the three-man crew which had broken through the wall. At the time of her murder, he was living in Fall River with his girlfriend. His girlfriend testified that she went to Cape Cod that weekend to spend time with her family, and he stayed in Fall River. But on Sunday morning, he called her up unexpectedly and said, "I'm coming to Cape Cod." And he arrived there, but remained in bed the whole time. They came back to Fall River, and the Rhode Island police arrived and wanted to talk to him. He told the police that he was home all night Saturday until he went out with some teenagers to get drunk. Then, a few days later, the detective went to his job site and questioned him again, and his story was different. So a number of people, including members of the construction crew, all gave DNA samples to the police. On June 9th, Motika voluntarily provided the police with a blood sample, and he was arrested on June 24th because it was a match. When the detectives asked him to explain why his semen was found in her body, Motika told them that he and his girlfriend would also have sex in the morning before he went to work, and he would clean himself off in her tub. His girlfriend testified that they never had sex in the morning, that if they ever had sex, it would be in the evening, but she hadn't had sex with him in a long time. And then when they had sex, he would wipe himself off with a baby nap, so he didn't go wash himself elsewhere. And the doctor testified that there's no way seminal fluid can go into you because the vagina is a closed environment. It snaps shut, and it doesn't go that way. It comes out, but it doesn't go in. Jeremy Motika was convicted of raping and murdering in the first degree of Angela Spence Shaw. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. with a concurrent life sentence for the first-degree sexual assault charge. In September of 2017, his lawyer argued before the State Supreme Court of Rhode Island that his appeal was wrongly dismissed without an evidentiary hearing. In December, Rhode Island Supreme Court vacated the lower court's denial, and Matoika was entitled to a hearing on the merits of its application. This is a to be continued. He's still held, but he may walk.
Any case that stands out in your mind that you worked on personally?
The one from Little Compton, Angela Spence Shaw, in 1999, I believe it was 1999, this elderly lady was found submerged in her bathtub, and she had been brutally beaten and raped. And we worked on the case, and we had a DNA profile, but the police had nobody as a suspect yet. They continued to sample people all along over a period of days, and we got in about 24 different samples from different people, and it was about the 15th person that we got a match, and his name was Jeremy Motika, and he was part of a crew that was working on her house at the time. He was about in his 20s, and he was later convicted of that case, but it was the case really focused on DNA, and it was critical in the case.
I've got to ask you, I know you said you separate yourself from this.
Mm-hmm.
What was that moment like when you got a match?
It was the aha moment, basically, really. It was, and then calling the police, and everybody comes down and wants all the information. It was a Friday afternoon, and I won't forget it.
There's DNA match, but there may be a procedural problem with the police and his arrest. So we'll see. So even if you're guilty of something and they have the DNA on you, there are ways to get out of jail if things aren't done properly. I'm not saying they weren't done properly, but he's claiming they weren't done properly. And so much so that he's given a second chance to appeal his conviction, that it was deemed enough to cause an appeal. So Little Compton doesn't sound like a nice place to me, is it?
It's a very nice place.
It's a very nice place, but lock your doors. Oh my gosh. Ugh. A Sonnet Freetown. Bill mentioned this case 2 weeks ago, I guess, the Bullock murder. This is Bullock's grave in New Bedford, so that's why I put it there. Isaiah John Bullock, he was killed by a man named Obed Reynolds, who was 18 years old. And about 7 o'clock on the evening of June 30th, 1862, the body of John Bullock was found shockingly mangled. There was evidence that there had been a struggle. Blood was found in his wagon and a considerable quantity on both sides of the road. About 20 shots took effect on his face and neck. So I guess it's a shotgun. And 25 stab wounds were found on his body, 3 or 4 to his breast and body, several of them being mortal. His watch, valued at $100, was found in his pocket. Was missing. Also his pocketbook, but $10 was found in his pocket. It's not known how much money he had on him at the time. Mr. Bullock was last seen near a Sonnet at 5:30 o'clock. I love that, 5:30 o'clock. I'm gonna start using that. That just sounds great. What time is it? It's 5:30. He had had a conversation with a woman in reference to a piece of land that he wanted to purchase. While he was talking to her, a man was seen to pass who had a gun with him, and they suspected that this guy might have something to do with the killing. And according to Phillips in his History of Fall River, the murder caused widespread consternation because the desolate youth, seeking only to possess a few dollars, was lying in wait for a dry goods and grocery peddler whose weekly route caused him to pass through this lonely road, which in fact he had traversed the previous day. when Bullock happened along returning to his New Bedford home from his delivery of a barrel of rum to the kitchen barroom at Slab Bridge in Freetown. The youth had held him up, blinded him with a gunshot, and then during a scuffle which followed, the gun was wrestled from him and he stabbed Bullock to death. Reynolds returned to his home and his father turned him over to the police. Yay. Thank you, Daddy. According to Walter Clark, who gave an interview in 1934, he said his father spoke with Obed Reynolds as the lad was walking along the road that fateful day with a gun under his arm. His father told his son that after Obed had reached home, he hid under the bed for a time and did other peculiar things to arouse suspicion from his father, Noah Reynolds. He was intending to get married, but he was sorely in need of money. He was young, and like many boys of his years, he had nothing in his own right, and it is believed that Reynolds' long yearning for cash, coupled with his drinking, caused him to commit the brutal crime. An indictment charging murder was returned against Reynolds, who pled not guilty. The trial was May 19th in Taunton, and it lasted until May 21st, and the verdict of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. On January 7th, 1864, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Governor John Andrew. Reynolds developed tuberculosis during his incarceration and died about 6 months after the commutation of his sentence for life imprisonment. Now, what's interesting is the monument that's there, which is still there. Barry French sent me these photographs that he took in 1962. So this is Bullock Road. Now, I went looking at Bullock Road. Now, Bullock Road runs from all the way to Fonts Corner Road, all the way down into a sonnet. Bell Rock Road to Bullock Road turns into that. And it's a big, long, beautiful road. I mean, it's really lovely. This is the way it looked in 62. And that's the monument there, that little finger thing sticking up. It's a piece of granite that was placed there at the site of the murder by Clark, the man who did the interview. His father did that because he knew Obed, he knew Bullock. It was his tribute, and that's where it happened, so that's where it was. I was just there, and this is the shot I took. I was there last week before it got super hot and rained, and this is the site of it now from the same point of view. So there's houses there now. This was it in 1962. It had a bee painted on it, and now it has pink paint on it, and it's a part of like a little garden display. This is the back of it. It almost looks like a face. But you can see the chisel marks in it. So it was cut a certain size, and it stays there. It doesn't fall over. So it's really cool. It's actually really cool. And this is he's buried, Obed is buried in Freetown, and this is Obed's gravestone. And he died of consumption while he was in jail. So he didn't get hung, but he caught the consumption while he was in prison. So in a sense, they killed him. This is a very, very weird, sad story. These two people were each 21 years old. They were engaged to be married, and they were on a lover's lane in Freetown, right off Bullock Road, again. And for no apparent reason, someone shot them to death on May 1st, 1965. She was shot 3 times in the chest, and he was shot 4 times in the head. 7 .22 caliber casings were found at the scene. The police found his wallet containing $6, and she had $20 in her purse, ruling out robbery. They had last been seen driving down the lane at 7 p.m., and their bodies were discovered the next day at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined they died approximately 10 hours ago, putting their time of death around 10:30 p.m. They were found by Charles Westgate of Freetown as he was out horseback riding. The windshield and the front door on the right side of the car were riddled with bullet holes. When the police arrived, the driver's side was open. They'd been engaged for 3 years and were planning an August wedding. A reconstruction indicated that she was struck first in the chest from a distance by a bullet that went through the windshield. He was shot 3 times in the head and chest as he started to get out of the car. Then the killer fired 2 more rounds into her. Robert Herren was arrested on May 6, 1965, based on a tip at his place of employment. His car, a station wagon, was impounded and was said to have matched the description of the vehicle near the crime scene. Robert Herren was ordered committed to Bridgewater State Mental Hospital for 35 days of mental evaluation. Deemed a violent youth, it was determined that this was in the best interests of his health. Oddly, no other details are found about this case. It is not known if Herren was permanently committed, if he pleaded in the case, whether there was an indictment. It's entirely possible that he is still alive today because he would only be in his mid-60s. There's no death certificate, but death certificates are hard to come by in modern times. They're easier when it's free information because of time passing, like census records. Because the last census record is what, 1940? That's available. So they wait 75 years before they release the next census, right? So the 1950 census isn't due out for a while. So we don't know why he did it. We don't know. It's just a senseless, horrible killing that sounds like California, not Freetown. Like the Zodiac killer, right? Mary Lou Arruda. Now you recognize her. She was murdered by a man named James Cater. On September 8th, 1978, about 4 o'clock, 15-year-old Mary Lou disappeared while riding her bicycle. I'll let you go. Near her home in Raynham. Her bicycle was found at 4:30 that same day by the side of the road. Next to it was an automobile tire track with an acceleration mark. The track characteristics were very odd and interesting and were different. A Benson & Hedges cigarette butt was found in the middle of the road. And 2 months later, on November 11th, 1978, her decomposed, fully clothed body was found tied to a tree in the Freetown State Forest. The cause of her death was strangulation by ligature or positional asphyxia. A pathologist testified that she'd been alive in the standing position when she was tied to the tree, but once she became unconscious, the weight of her head against the ligature around her neck caused her to suffocate. She probably died the same day that she was taken. Around the time Arruda disappeared, 5 individuals in her neighborhood noticed an unfamiliar bright green automobile with a black or silver stripe and black lettering. It amazes me that somebody who's doing such a crime drives around in such an obvious, noticeable car. One of them described him as a white male with curly hair and dark-rimmed glasses. Another said that they saw someone else in the car, but they didn't know who it was. Probably her. The boy who found her bicycle returned it to her home, and her mother called the police. And for the next 3 days, they searched for her. On September 9th, 78, police developed photographs of the automobile tire tracks. And then they published a wanted poster containing a composite likeness of the driver. 3 days later, the police received information on Cater, including a photograph of him. He met with the police in Raynham, and the police noted that his appearance was consistent with the composite, that he smoked Benson & Hedges cigarettes. He gave the police permission to search his automobile, a bright green Opel with black racing stripe. The front right tire tread was similarly unusual as the tire tracks found near the bicycle. Inside the car, they saw wedding gifts, 2 cartons of Benson & Hedges cigarettes, and 2 pairs of dark-rimmed glasses in the glove compartment. In the trunk, under some luggage, they found newspapers open to the case. In checking his alibi, they learned that he was not, in fact, in any of the places he said he was, and that his Opel was seen at 4:30 in the immediate vicinity of Freetown State Forest, where her body was found. He had previously committed a similar crime to the one perpetrated against Mary Lou Arruda. In 1969, he pled guilty to indictments of assault with intent to rape, assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon, and kidnapping. They related to a 1969 abduction and attack on Jocelyn Boussier. Between 1:30 and 2:30, she was walking her bicycle home on a quiet street in North Andover when she noticed a blue automobile in front of her. It was the same car that had passed her several times that afternoon. The driver, James N. Cater, was standing in the middle of the road, and he asked her for directions. When she turned to point where he could go, he grabbed her and threw her into the car, pushing her down underneath the glove compartment. He had an iron bar in his hand, so she felt threatened. He immediately got in the driver's seat and drove very fast, traveled for about 30 minutes, and he stopped the car, pulled her out, and walked her further into the woods. He hit her on the back of the head with the iron bar and forced her to kneel into a stream. As he tried to force her face into the water, she grabbed his glasses and threw them, so he went to look for his glasses, and she started to run, and he grabbed her again, and he put her back in the car, and then he drove some more, and then he pulled her out of the car, and he took her into the woods and tied her up against a tree. He used strips from a torn bed sheet to tie her hands, ankles, and torso against the tree. After 20 minutes of pacing back and forth, he came up behind her and pulled the last strip of bedspread very tight around her neck, which strangled her with his hands. She lost consciousness, but she regained consciousness, and she was alone, slumped over and bound to the tree. She managed to untie herself, and she ran and found help. From there, she was taken home to the hospital and then to the police. He was convicted of this kidnapping and served 10 years in prison. He acknowledged pleading guilty to that case, but said he had nothing to do with Mary Lou Arruda. But at his trial, 5 witnesses testified that the car was similar in color, size, and markings to the car, that the FBI testified that the tire tread was the same tire tread, and in 1979, a jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree. But his verdict was reversed because certain testimony had been, or might have been, hypnotically aided, and it had been erroneously admitted at trial. You can't hypnotize someone to remember something and then use that testimony in a murder trial. It's not proven that you can hypnotize someone to remember something. It is done, but not when somebody's life is on the line. So it's inadmissible to give testimony based on something you were hypnotized to remember. So he was retried after they took out that testimony and was found guilty again. He appealed based on the same issue, and sure enough, there was some testimony that was still a part of that hypnotic testimony. What's with the Commonwealth, okay? The third trial began in October of '92, and a mistrial was held because they couldn't decide. And then a year and a half later, he moved to dismiss it, saying that it was double jeopardy because he'd been tried 3 times, and it was denied. Prior to the 4th trial, the Commonwealth filed a motion to admit evidence of his previous bad acts, which was allowed. The 4th trial began in '96, and 3 months later, 18 years after he killed Mary Lou Arruda, he was found guilty of kidnapping and murder in the first degree. James Cater died in prison from cancer on January 23rd, 2016, finally putting to end the grueling ordeal experienced by Mary Lou's mother, who had to live 38 years of this retrial of Cater. I want to shoot him a bird, don't you? Such an evil person. Oh yes, we murder in Westport too, you know. It's not just Fall River and New Bedford. And yes, they murder in Westport. Not at the fair, but other places. This is the case of what I told you about, Tillinghast Kirby, 1903. It's an interesting case. He'd been out fishing on his little boat. And he was apparently living with two other guys. He was living with Angus Snell, and he was also living with a man named Burton Head. And they were fishing together, because Tillinghast had his own property in Westport, in fact, on Charlotte White Road. He had his own property, but he was down at the point, he was down at Gooseberry, he was fishing. So he was staying a little brief amount of time rooming with these two guys who were fishing together. Well, he didn't return when he went out one day, and Snell was hired by the man's son, Edward Kirby, to go look for him. So they went out on a boat, and they found his boat. Snell found his boat. Oh, look, I found his boat. And on September 19th, heavy weather forced the body up from the bottom of the water where it had been bound with pig iron. And it came ashore at Gooseberry Neck, and so they had a body. Now, Snell was arrested, but only because he all of a sudden had money when he didn't have money, and Kirby's money was gone. So they figured he took the money, right? And so the police alleged that actually this whole thing was a quarrel over a woman. Yeah, it's weird. So Snell hired this woman to take care of their house, and he fell in love with her. But his Burton Head was also in liking of her. So she was kind of hanging out with Burton Head, and Snell wanted her. But she laughed in his face and said, "You don't have any money. I can't be with you. You can't provide for me." All right, he said, "I'm going to have some money soon." So he went to Kirby and asked to borrow money, and Kirby said no. Snell was determined, it was determined he was the last person to see Kirby alive, and he made conflicting statements about his whereabouts. And after a trial of 9 days, Angles Snell, it's not Angel, and I haven't miswritten it. He was found guilty of murder in the first degree, and he was sentenced to death by electrocution. And his death was to have occurred a week later. But Governor William Douglas of Massachusetts commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. After his commutation, he was sent to Charlestown Prison, and he dropped dead in state prison on March 14th, 1905, at the age of 69, of cirrhosis of the coronary arteries. And it was revealed that he had confessed to his jailer to committing 5 murders, of which robbery had been the sole motive. He admitted to killing Tillinghast Kirby and confessed to the murder of Peleg Cornell, 2 strangers who came to Westport on vacation, and an unknown Portuguese who had paid Snell to guide him around. He also admitted to burning a barn for revenge. Bye, Angles. Serial killer. Do you know this case? This should bring, you know this guy, right? Yeah, she put it in his Jello, all right. I think you got to the word Jello, right? He was 61, and his girlfriend, Christina Martin, was 40. Oh, I'm sorry. He was 61. My mistake. That doesn't look like a 46-year-old man, does it? He was 61. And they were living together in Westport. And the Commonwealth's theory was that she had caused his death by putting LSD in his Jello. This is her at her trial. I will let this speak for the case. I can't explain it any better.
Because of his heart disease, the local medical examiner decided not to perform an autopsy. Richard Alfredo was buried 4 days after his death. All of his assets, worth about $25,000, went to his estranged wife and children. Alfredo's girlfriend, 39-year-old Christina Martin, continued to live in the house the couple shared, along with her 2 children from a previous marriage. 4 weeks after Richard Alfredo's death, rumors circulated that his death was no accident. The daughter of Alfredo's girlfriend, Tisha, allegedly told friends that Alfredo had made sexual advances towards her. And she also said that her mother put the drug LSD in Alfredo's gelatin dessert in an effort to kill him. To see if LSD had caused Alfredo's death, the medical examiner exhumed his body 6 weeks after the funeral. The samples were sent to 2 different labs for testing, the state crime lab and another private laboratory. Dr. Louis Amoruso performed the testing at the private lab and used what is called a radioimmunoassay test, or RIA. Both the private lab and the police lab found 2 drugs present in Alfredo's system. One was diphenhydramine, a common over-the-counter cold medication. The other was LSD. Richard Alfredo's death was no longer considered an accident. It was now murder, a heart attack brought on by acute LSD intoxication. Christina Martin was charged with first-degree murder. At the trial, prosecutors presented the toxicological evidence of LSD in Richard Alfredo's system, and a drug dealer testified that Christina was present when he sold LSD to Tisha's high school friends. That was all the prosecution needed. Christina Martin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. And that's where the case stood for 7 long years.
There had never been a case reported where a person had died from the direct effects of LSD. So right away, that allegation was inconsistent with a whole body of scientific information dating back to the mid-60s. That's a 30-year period of time.
The RIA test was designed to work only on fresh urine samples, which the medical examiner didn't have after the body was autopsied. The labs tested tissue samples and degraded blood, all of which had been embalmed. The RIA test is only for screening. Any positive results must then be retested to confirm the results.
In order to say with 100% certainty that it was LSD that was present in the body, one would have to go to a confirmatory test. The gold standard, or the test that is considered to be the most dependable, is the one that's called gas chromatography mass spectrometry.
For whatever reason, Christina Martin's first lawyer never questioned the test results. When Kevin Mahoney examined the case file from Christina Martin's first trial, he found an important piece of evidence. It was evidence that prosecutors never presented at the first trial. Prosecutors had commissioned the confirmatory test on Alfredo's tissue samples using a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. It's a test that can identify every substance in the sample.
That test detected no LSD in any of the samples. Even though they tested and retested and retested, they were desperate to confirm what they had learned from the radioimmunoassay test, but they weren't able to do that.
In his decision, Judge Dorfer cited defects in the scientific evidence and the prosecution's failure to disclose critical exculpatory evidence as grounds for a new trial. Christina Martin agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of time served. In other words, Christina Martin was a free woman.
I
pleaded guilty because of the plea bargain and the chance that I might go back to jail. I didn't want that.
I would have liked to have had this woman found not guilty. But this is not the first person in Massachusetts to say they did something in order to get out of being prosecuted. When your feet are being held to the fire, you're going to do things you really don't want to do.
Because we're running late, I'm going to skip to the very last murder, which is my favorite murder, if one could have favorite murders. I'm going to skip to it. Sorry. Yeah, my favorite murder. It's a Dartmouth murder. The murder of Elizabeth Barrow. She was 100 years old when she was killed. The woman who killed her was Laura Lundquist, who was 98. She was very upset because she believed that her 100-year-old roommate at the Brandon Woods nursing home was conniving to take over her room. At 6:20, only 20 minutes after staff had seen her return to her bed from the bathroom, Elizabeth Barrow was found dead with a bed sheet pulled over her head and a plastic bag tied around her head. The women had been arguing about Lundquist placing a table at the foot of Barrow's bed. A nurse's aide moved the table so Barrow could have a path to the bathroom, and Lundquist punched her. It was reported that Lundquist vowed that she would get Barrow's window side bed, and she was planning to outlive her. Lundquist told the investigators that she was in the bathroom when Barrow died and she heard her scream, but she didn't want to do anything because she was afraid she might get into trouble. She thought that Barrow had committed suicide. Laura Lundquist was sent to Taunton State Hospital for a competency evaluation, and it was determined that she had a long-standing diagnosis of dementia. Additionally, she had exhibited erratic behaviors. Previously, she felt that another roommate wanted to strangle her in her bed. She was found not competent to stand trial and committed to Taunton State Hospital. Now, the thing is, she was still alive in 2016. She was 104. I can find no obituary for her. So as far as I know, this lady's still alive. And the reason why is because the son of Barrow, who was in his late 60s and early 70s after this time, sued the nursing home because of the danger that was posed to his mother, even though she was 100, by this roommate who had been violent before. And there was a law that said, the nursing home said that there was an arbitration agreement, that he could only go to arbitration over her death. Turns out Mrs. Barrow never signed that document. And because of the son Scott Barrow's pushing this, a law was passed that no longer are nursing homes allowed to weigh out what happened based on arbitration, that the victims have a right. And so after many years of fighting this, they got a jury together. He was going to court. He was allowed to sue the nursing home. They had a jury picked. They were just about to start, and the nursing home settled. So an undisclosed amount. So Mrs. Barrow's dead. Mrs. Lundquist is possibly still alive. In 2016, when he received his settlement, she was still alive in Taunton, and she was 104. So she outlived this woman, like she vowed she would. It's the only murder, it is the murder in the whole United States of the oldest person being accused of murder. She was never convicted and never indicted. Sam Sutter said, "What's the point?" Well, she was demented, she had dementia, and she was going to die soon anyway, but she didn't die soon anyway. Go figure. I guess Laura Lundquist had the last laugh.